Thanks to everyone here, especially Josh and John, for putting together this conference. I know you're disappointed that Rod Berry isn't here, and I'd rather be up there with you listening to him at this point, but in my capacity as pinch hitter, I will try at least to foul one off, which is something my beloved Phillies haven't been able to do even for the last month, it seems. My only objection, though, now that we've gotten rid of the Microsoft banner, is we don't have a Maryland flag. Could we have one of these that just went up to here? It's okay. Protestants in the United States have more at stake in the discussions and presentations at this conference than they do in the candidacies of Michelle Bachmann or Rick Perry. That assertion should be obvious to most people who recognize the substantial limitations of the Congresswoman from Minnesota and the Governor of Texas, or to those who understand that the Republican Party represents only a tiny fraction of what motivates traditionalist conservatives, or even to those who understand that the official in the White House is hardly going to make a dent in what afflicts this Barca Lounger republic. In other words, front porchers know something that many American Protestants don't, despite Old Testament warnings about princes, namely, not to trust or have high expectations for public officials. My assertion about what Protestants might learn at this conference has less to do with politics than it does with religion, and it bears directly on the theme of this session, namely localism and globalism. Most American Protestants are suckers for globalism. They don't even reach for their guns when a person calls himself a global Christian, because they have no feel for localism. Of course, they believe that globalism is a religious good because the good book they read for edification speaks of a faith with global, even cosmic dimensions. After all, Christ is not a local deity worshipped by the residents of a particular city, but the Lord God of the universe. For this theological reason, globalism comes naturally to my Christian tribe, the Protestants. But chalking up this global instinct among Protestants simply to biblical descriptions of Christ's authority would miss some significant historical developments, particularly in the United States, that have great bearing on American Protestantism's public face and that are also consequential for the way that religion functions in our public debates. The typical way of explaining contemporary Protestantism is to divide it between its evangelical and liberal Protestant parts. These days, this divide is not much of a fight, since the religious right has essentially knocked the mainline and oldest Protestant denominations from their place as the Protestant establishment. The only time when journalists seem to pay attention to the mainline churches is when those communions give further evidence that for them Christian morality does not apply to parts of the body below the waist. Otherwise, pollsters, scholars, and editors follow the utterances of evangelical pastors and celebrities in hopes of calculating how many born-again voters will cast their ballots for the Republican candidate, usually to the tune of 3/4 of the evangelical electorate. According to this division between evangelicals and mainline Protestants, the evangelicals are the conservative, red state voters, while mainliners, mainly clergy, since historically the mainline churches voted Republican, are the liberals who thrive in urban centers that turn coastal states blue. But this way of understanding Protestantism does grave injustice to the history of Protestant churches in the United States, and along the way misconstrues the nature of conservatism, both political and religious. The central dynamic in American Protestantism has not been liberalism against conservatism, but localism versus cosmopolitanism. A word better rendered in ecclesiastical categories is ecumenism. Ever since 1740, the date we associate with the revivals of the First Great Awakening, a strand of Protestantism that has promoted the universals of love, justice, faith, and holiness over the truths that had previously defined the constituted churches of Europe and that persisted in several British colonies in North America. In other words, having Jesus in a believer's heart trumped having Christ's presence in the Lord's Supper. Furthermore, the bonds of a shared experience of divine presence in the soul became a stronger basis for membership and identity than belonging to a communion that followed a certain order of worship, confessed the same creed, or implemented the same rules for church governance. The effects of the revivals launched by Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield on Protestant communions would not be felt fully until the 19th century. Then another bout of awakenings, this time led by Charles G. Finney, who wound up his career teaching moral philosophy at Oberlin College, kicked down the door that had separated Protestant denominations. At that point in American history, the pattern of religious disestablishment allowed born-again Protestants to organize voluntary associations that sometimes enraptured Tocqueville and that also undercut the significance of the ecclesiastical ties that separated Baptists from Lutherans, from Presbyterians, from Congregationalists, and so on. The benevolent empire of reform, philanthropic, educational, and religious institutions bound born-again Protestants together in a confederacy of low church Protestantism that looked upon Christians, both Roman Catholic and sacramental Protestants, as popish and un-American. The ties between the first and second not-so-great awakenings in breaking down denominational barriers were not lost upon 20th century historians of ecumenism, who regularly trace the origins of cooperation and church union to the disregard that 18th century revivalists showed toward the inherited and particular structures of Protestant churches. The 19th century John Williamson Nevin, who started out life as a Scotch-Irish Presbyterian and ended up laboring among the German Reformed, not too far from here in Mercersburg, Pennsylvania, felt acutely the disparity between a personal and intimate form of Christianity with one rooted in churchly places. Nevin described the old Presbyterian faith that he grew up with in the following terms. It was based throughout on the idea of covenant family religion, church membership by God's holy act in baptism, and following this, a regular catechetical training of the young with direct reference to their coming to the Lord's table. In word, all proceeded on the theory of sacramental educational religion as it had belonged properly to all the national branches of the Reformed Church in Europe from the beginning. As opposed to the American habit of getting religion by means of revival, Nevin argued that historic Presbyterianism was essentially a churchly faith. For Nevin, no image better captured this churchly devotion than Calvin's idea of the Church of Mother. That is, there is no other entrance into life save that she may conceive us in her womb, give us birth, nourish us from her breasts, and embrace us in her loving care to the end. That's a quote from Calvin. Ironically, the point for Nevin as a young man the turning point occurred not when he grew up to become a communicant member of the Presbyterian Church, but instead when he went off to college and experienced another way of becoming a Christian. In Nevin's own words, the New England Puritan faith that informed Union College, where he enrolled as an undergraduate, was a serious challenge to the educational and churchly scheme of religion in which he had been reared. And I'm quoting, "I had come to college, a boy of strongly pious dispositions and exemplary religious habits, never doubting that I was in some way a Christian, though it had not come with me yet, unfortunately, to what is called a public profession of religion. But now one of the first lessons inculcated on me indirectly by this unchurchly system of revival was that all this must pass for nothing and that I must learn to look upon myself as an outcast from the family and kingdom of God." End of quote. Nevin remembered having no power to withstand the shock of this unchurchly scheme. And when a revival of religion broke out at Union, he submitted to the anxious meetings and underwent the torture of the mechanical counsel and talk, and finally converted at the age of 17. However much Nevin's memory may have played tricks on him, his reflections on the differences between revivalist Protestantism and the churchly forms inherited from his Scotch-Irish forebears were sufficiently weighty to explain his transfer to the German Reformed Church. For Nevin, born-again Protestantism pitted an intense subjectivity against the grand and glorious objectivities of the Christian life. After seeing revivalism eat away the vitals of churchly Presbyterianism, Nevin had welcomed the opportunity to move into the German Reformed communion where revivalism was being kept at bay. Almost 60 years after Nevin wrote his autobiography, the German Reformed Church was still trying to maintain a churchly system of religion in the face of the individualistic and experiential faith that dominated the United States and its Protestant churches. At the end of its instructions to catechumens about the meaning of confirmation and how this method of conversion differed from the model dominant in Protestant churches was the following. Some persons not understanding our church life and customs foolishly think that we confirm our young people no matter what their state of mind and heart is, and that we do not believe in conversion. This is a great mistake. We require a high degree of fitness for confirmation, namely an intelligent, sincere, and unreserved taking of three most searching and far-reaching vows in the name of the Holy Trinity. End of quote. The process of confirmation was sort of like conversion, but was not sudden, since it did not necessarily consist of wonderful religious experiences, nor was it the sort of thing that you could date precisely. Instead, confirmation took time, the growth of years, and happened in a very quiet way. This German Reformed advice to catechumens concluded with the reassurance that confirmation was the Reformed doctrine of getting religion. We get religion not in bulk, but little by little. Just as we get natural life and strength, so spiritual life and strength day by day. The German Reformed Church's understanding of confirmation was, in the author's minds, at odds with ways of acquiring and practicing the Christian religion that revivalist-inspired Protestantism had fashioned into the mainstream American faith. Consequently, the experience of the German Reformed at the beginning of the 20th century was a variation on the theme that has played out in the history of various confessional Protestant groups in the United States, namely that the old ways of Protestantism were no longer effective in the new American society. In fact, historic Protestant practices and beliefs have been refashioned in such a way that the clergy and public acts of worship were no longer essential to Christian identity. Although Nevin spoke for a wing of confessional Protestantism that continually resurfaced with each wave of European immigrants that came to the United States, with experience in a churchly setting, the momentum of American Protestantism during the greatest period of immigration was toward the born-again global variety that used individual experience to build a religious and political collective that sought from newcomers conformity to American Protestant norms, or else suffer the stigma of parochialism, sectarianism, and un-Americanism. Between 1870 and 1920, Anglo-American Protestants constructed a variety of organizations, the most important of which was the Federal Council of Churches, to oppose threats to the United States coming from socialism, materialism, atheism, Mormonism, and Roman Catholicism. The fundamentalist controversy ruptured the working agreement that had bound the Protestant descendants of the benevolent empire, but it did not yield among revival-based Protestants any awareness or attachment to the local and the particular. Instead, it launched another group of Protestants, today's evangelicals, who wanted to do for those who still believed in the importance of the born-again experience what Protestant Ecumenism and the social gospel had done to establish the largest Protestant denominations as the moral guardians of the American Republic. Consequently, the generation of evangelicals associated with Billy Graham formed a variety of cooperative institutions whose purpose was to unite born-again Protestants into a force that would supplant the Protestant mainline and resurrect a Christian America. The importance of creeds, sacraments, and ecclesiastical procedures were no more important to these cooperative agencies than they had been to the Protestants who formed the Federal Council of Churches. This hasty overview of the difference between a form of Protestantism based in experience with individual experience connected with global aspirations, and another rooted in churchly forms willing to let those forms limit cooperation, corresponds fairly neatly to the argument that Patrick Deneen recently laid out based on his reading of Robert Nisbet's Quest for Community, first at the ISI Honors Conference this summer and then at Front Porch Republic. For instance, Deneen wrote, "The state does not merely serve as a referee between contesting individuals in securing our capacity to engage in productive activities, especially commerce. The state establishes a condition in reality that existed in theory only in the state of nature. That is the ever-increasing achievement of the autonomous, freely choosing individual. Rather than the state acting as an impediment to the realization of our individuality, the state becomes the main agent of our liberation from the limiting conditions in which humans have historically found themselves, in other words, from places. Deneen added, far from fundamentally opposing one another, the individualism arising from the philosophy of classical liberalism and the subsequent philosophy of collectivism have been mutually reinforcing. Indeed, they have powerfully combined to all but wrap the vestiges of the ancient conception of virtue as a practice or even an option. Today's conservatives or classical liberals and liberals or progressive liberals remain locked in a battle for their preferred endgame, whether we will be a society of ever more perfected, liberated, autonomous individuals or ever more egalitarian members of a global community. Insert ecumenism for the state in these quotations and substitute mainline Protestants for liberals and evangelicals for conservatives, and you have a Protestant version of the dynamics that Deneen describes. Ecumenism liberated individual believers from the mediating structures of congregations, councils, pastors, denominations, and even sacraments. A Protestant is either an evangelical or a liberal, without any reference to a theological or ecclesiastical tradition. It is akin to referring to Americans as liberals or conservatives and never speaking of their place of residence. This is why evangelicals have more invested in this conference than the 2012 presidential primaries. Evangelicals need to understand and appreciate the value of what they too often dismiss as sectarian and parochial. That is, they need to see what happens in a local body of believers, gathered for both potluck and Lord's suppers, is of far more consequence to their earthly and heavenly existence than the fortunes of the greatest nation on God's green earth. And they need to come to a conference at a Roman Catholic university to begin to appreciate the significance of localism, because they are never going to encounter it in their local churches or from their favorite presidential candidate.